Pull up a seat at the table because today I'm teaching you how to play the Power Rangers deck building game from Renegade Game Studios. I'm Mark Maya, and this is Board Game Coffee. It's morphin' time! Or is it time to teach those pesky teenagers a lesson? Well, in Power Rangers the deck building game, you can do both. Take on the role of the flip-kicking, blaster-blasting Power Rangers as they hop in their amazing mechanized Zords to thwart the evil schemes of Lord Zed and Rita Repulsa. Or be the villain, commanding your very own army of foot soldiers to do your bidding, and that bidding being, destroy the Power Rangers. The Power Rangers deck building game is a 2 to 4 player experience that can be played 1v1, 2v2, or even 2v1. The game pits players against each other in a fight to the death. Well, nobody actually dies in the Power Rangers, so you're going to have to settle for reducing their health tracker to 0. But whoever does that first wins. It's important to note that Power Rangers is an asymmetric game, which means both sides, heroes and villains, plays a little bit differently. But we'll be covering both sides, so don't you worry. In this video, I'll be focusing primarily on the 2-player 1v1 rule set. If at any point you want to jump to a particular section of this video, check out the index in the description below. Now, for a quick overview. The Power Rangers deck building game is, well, a deck building game. Players start with a basic set of cards, which they use to buy better cards in order to improve their deck. Those new cards can then be used to buy additional cards, trigger a wide variety of powerful abilities, and battle adversaries. I mentioned at the start of the video that the game is asymmetric, meaning that each side, hero and villain, play a little differently from each other. The villains, for example, have a lair where all the masters hang out, and each master there unlocks a new ability the villains can use against the heroes. Heroes, on the other hand, have Zords, which they store in their Zord Bay. Each Zord on its own provides a unique ability, which is cool and all, but the Zords are at their best when they form the powerful Megazord, or even better, the Mega Dragon Zord. Now that you have a good idea of what the Power Rangers is all about, let's get to the setup. The first thing you're going to need to determine is who will be playing the part of the villain and who will be the hero. Then shuffle both stacks of oversized character cards separately and deal out 2 random heroes to the hero player and 2 random villains to the villain player. Place the remaining character cards back in the box. Each player will now select 1 character to play with from the 2 they were dealt. Players are free to look through the character's signature item, Zord, or master card before making their decision. Any character card not selected will be returned to the box. If both players agree beforehand, they can also choose to play with whoever they want, as long as one side is playing a hero and the other a villain. If this is your first game, it's recommended that the hero plays with Jason Lee Scott, also known as the Red Ranger, and the villain plays with Rito Revolto. Once you've got your character selected, place it in front of you, teenage side up for the hero and scheming side up for the villain. Next, find the signature item and Zord card belonging to the selected hero and set them aside. A hero's signature item and Zord will have the color of the ranger they're associated with indicated here. Do the same thing for the villain character, but instead of a Zord, villains will have a master card with their name listed here. Now, place the remaining signature items back in the box. You won't be needing those anymore. But keep the Zord and master cards nearby. We're not done with those quite yet. The signature items, Zord, and MasterCard that you've set aside for each player are kind of like a private little market that only that player can buy from. But we'll learn more about that later in the video. Okay, let's prep the main deck and the grid and we'll build out our play area from there. For the main deck, you're going to need to collect all of your location, equipment, maneuver, hero, and villain cards. Give those cards a good shuffle and set the stack face down between the hero and villain players. This is your main deck. Now, take the top 6 cards of the main deck and place them face up in the middle of the table, forming your grid. During this initial setup, the grid shouldn't have more than 2 cards of the same type. A card's type is indicated here in the center, and each type has its own color-coded border which makes them easy to tell apart. In this example, we've drawn 2 heroes, 1 villain, and 3 equipment cards. Now that's 1 equipment card too many. Any cards drawn past 2 of any given type should be set aside and replaced. Once that's done, take the grid cards you set aside and shuffle them back into the main deck. The grid is where you'll buy new cards to improve your deck and potentially fight off some pesky adversaries. Now, remember those Zord and Master cards we set aside? Shuffle them separately and place them face down at the end of your grid like so. Then take the top card of each of those stacks and flip it face up. Since the villains can't buy from the Zord stack and the heroes can't buy from the Master stack, I like to keep the Zord stack on the hero side of the table and the Master stack on the villain side of the table. Place the stun cards face up and the Blade Blaster cards face down within easy reach of all players. Once that's done, flip over the top card of the Blade Blaster deck. Then place the Lair tile next to the villain player and the Zord Bay tile along with the double-sided Mega card next to the hero player. Now, deal 10 starting cards to each player. The hero player receives 7 Teamwork, 1 Recovery, 1 Attitude, and 1 Power Coin. While the villain receives 7 Mayhem, 1 Rebuild, 1 Disposable, and 1 Putty Clay. Although the hero and villain starting cards have different names, both sets are exactly the same. This way, both players start on a level playing field. Each player now shuffles their deck of 10 cards, places it face down next to them, and draws 5 cards off the top. And last but not least, give each player, or each team if you're playing with more than 2 players, their very own status tracker. Set the energy dial at the top of the tracker to 0, and the health point dial at the bottom to 30. Now that you're all set up, your table should look something like this. Alrighty, let's learn how to play. In the Power Rangers deck building game, each player's turn is broken up into 3 phases: the start phase, main phase, and end phase. The player taking on the role of the villain always goes first, which makes sense because you don't ever really need the heroes until the villains do something terrible. After that, turns bounce back and forth across the table between hero and villain. Now, before we break down those phases for you, let's take a look at the anatomy of a card and what it all means. At the top, you'll find the card's title. This number here is its shard cost. Kind of like a price tag. You need this many shards to buy this card. This is how many shards this card generates when it's played. The number below represents how much energy is added to your energy reserves, which is tracked here on this handy little status tracker. This window here describes a card's ability, and this number here to the left is the amount of energy required to activate that ability. And this is the shard cost to battle an adversary card. The reward for doing so is indicated in this black bar here. Lastly, this space indicates a card's type. Each card type also has its own color. Purple villains, yellow heroes, blue maneuvers, gray equipment, brown locations, and orange masters. The color coding makes it easy to see which cards work best with your character, but more on that later. Signature items count as every color, and we'll cover why that's important later as well. The first thing you're going to do on your turn before you play any cards or activate any abilities is refill the grid back up to 6 cards. The rule I mentioned during the setup about not having more than 2 cards of the same type in the grid no longer applies. That was only for the setup. Next, if the top card of the Blade Blaster, Zord, or Master stack is face down, flip it face up, because you can only buy face-up cards. Now, ready all cards attached to your character. This means if you have any cards that are sideways like this in their exhausted state, turn them right side up to their ready state. Any exhausted Zords in your Zord Bay do not ready at this time. We'll circle back on how to ready your Zords a little later in the video. Lastly, resolve any at the start of your turn effects, like this one, which generates 4 energy at the start of your turn. These effects are mostly found on Master cards. Now we move on to the main phase. The main phase is when the majority of the game takes place. At this time, you can perform any of these actions in any order as many times as you want on your turn. Play is when you play cards from your hand to generate shards and energy. Buy is when you spend your shards to purchase new cards. Attach involves attaching cards from your hand to an empty slot of the same color on your character card. Yellow card goes in the yellow slot, blue card goes in the blue slot. That sort of thing. Battle is when you battle adversary cards in the grid by paying the costs listed here in their battle icon. And discard gives you a chance to remove attached cards from your character, but only if those cards are in their ready state. The last thing I want to talk about before we dive into everything you can do in your main phase is your status tracker. Your status tracker tracks your life and energy totals. Every time you take damage or regain health, mark it here on your status tracker. Energy you generate is tracked in the same way on this dial with the energy icon. You can never gain more than 30 health or 20 energy. Any energy or health gained beyond that is lost. As you gain and lose health and energy, it's a good idea to call it out as you adjust your dials. That way, everyone at the table can follow along. Okay, now that's a quick rundown of all the actions you can take on your turn. Now let's break each of those down for you. When you play a card from your hand, it generates shards and energy, but it does not activate its ability. Abilities can only be activated while a card is attached to your character or Zord Bay. Attaching and playing a card are two completely different actions. So, once you choose to play a card for its shards and energy generation, you can't change your mind and decide to attach it to your character to activate its ability. Now, I did just say that to use a card's ability, it needs to be attached to your character. But there are a few exceptions to this rule. If a card has game text in its ability window, but does not have an activation cost associated with it, like with these starter cards, the ability takes effect when the card is played. No attachments necessary. The other exception to this rule are block cards. Whenever you see this shield with a hand icon in a card's ability window, you can activate it from your hand by paying its activation cost. But we'll cover how block cards work in more detail later in the video. The primary reason for playing cards is to generate shards and energy. When you generate shards, they only exist for the turn that they were generated. So at the end of that turn, any unspent shards are gone. They do not carry over to the next turn. Energy, on the other hand, does carry over. Each time you generate energy, record it on your status tracker. Energy recorded this way does not reset at the end of your turn, and is available to you until you spend it to activate abilities. There are 4 different locations on the table that you can buy cards from. The grid, the Blade Blaster stack, the Zord and Master stacks, depending on which side you're playing, and your personal little market space, which you set aside during the setup, which contains your signature item and Zord or Master card, again, depending on which side you're playing. This stack here is the Stun stack. Now, although these cards do have a cost of 0, you can't buy these, and you probably don't want to. Stun cards do nothing for you. They're only there to clog up your deck. Getting a stun card is usually the result of another card's effect. But that's enough about cards we don't want. Let's talk about the ones we do. As you play cards, total up the number of shards they generate. This is your currency total for this turn, and you can use it to buy as many cards as you can afford. So in this example, I've generated 4 shards, 2 from the Yellow Ranger, and 1 each from these Teamwork cards. Which means I can buy any one of these 2 cards, not this one, it's too expensive, or both of these cards, which cost 2 shards each. Whenever you remove a card from the grid, either because you bought it, fought it, or gained it in any other way, do not replace the missing cards. The grid does not refill until the start of the next player's turn. Once you buy the top face-up card of either the Blade Blaster, Zord, or Master stacks, you cannot buy any more cards from those stacks this turn, because you can't buy face-down cards. You'll have to wait until your next turn when the top card of those stacks has been flipped face-up. Although, before you're allowed to buy any cards from the Zord or Master stacks, you'll need to have already purchased or gained your own personal Zord or Master card. When you gain a card, either by buying it or acquiring it by other means, such as a card ability like this one that lets you take a card from the grid, place that card into your discard pile unless the card you're gaining says otherwise. Here are a few examples of cards that do not go into your discard pile when gained. Location cards are placed in front of you, and in most cases, you can start making use of their ongoing effect right away. Signature items are instantly attached to your character. If there are no available slots on your character, only then do they go to your discard pile. Zords are placed in your Zord Bay, and your character's Master card is automatically placed into the orange slot along the bottom of their character card. If the slot is filled with your signature item, place your Master card into the discard pile. If the Master card you gained was from the Master stack, place it directly below your Lair tile. If an effect ever allows you to gain a card, you acquire that card without paying any shards. And buying cards can be done anytime during your turn, before or after any other action. So you could buy a card, activate an ability, attach a card, then buy another card. It's completely up to you. But there is one important rule that you mustn't forget. Heroes can never buy villain cards, and villains can never buy hero cards. Instead, players can choose to battle adversary cards to remove them from the grid. More on battling later. Oh, one more thing. If a card ever asks you to gain the top card of the main deck, and the card you gain is an adversary card, add that card to your discard pile like any other card. Even though you can't attach adversary cards to your character, you can still use them for their shard and energy generation. The edges of your character card are color-coded to match a certain type of card. These edges are your character slots. Instead of playing a card from your hand for its shard and energy generation, you may instead attach that card to a matching colored slot on your character card. The card you attach to your character must match the color of the slot you're attaching it to. I can attach this yellow hero card to my character's yellow slot, but I couldn't attach it to its blue slot. When you decide to attach a card to your character rather than playing it, you don't generate any shards or energy. If you don't have an available slot or any cards that match the color of the slots that are available, then you cannot attach a card. Signature items match any color, so you can place them in any empty slot you want. And when you buy your signature item, it instantly attaches to any available slot on your character. If you have no available slots when purchasing your signature item, add it to your discard pile instead. Later I'll teach you how to discard a card attached to your character to make room for more. At the start of the game, hero characters start with their teenager side face up, and villains start with their scheming side face up. But they each have a powerful final form that you'll definitely want to upgrade to. When a character's 4 slots are filled, flip it to its final form. Teenagers morph into rangers, and scheming villains become empowered. If attaching the 4th card triggers an effect on your character, resolve that effect before flipping it over. Once flipped, a character card never flips back to its starting side, even if cards become detached from their slots. In addition, when the hero character flips over, attach that hero's Zord to the Zord Bay for free. And when the villain character flips over, that player gets to draw 1 additional card from the top of their deck. Character cards also feature abilities that you can use. The starting side of each character has either a triggered ability that generates an effect when a certain condition is met, like playing a certain type of card or attaching a card, or a static ability that is always in effect until you flip over your character. The effect could be anything from drawing a card to dealing damage to the opposing team. The other side of your character card will have more powerful abilities that you can activate once per turn. To activate an ability on a card attached to your character, simply pay the energy cost indicated here in this blue and white sideways arrow, and deduct the cost from the energy portion of your status tracker. If you don't have enough energy stored on your tracker, then you can't activate that ability. But if you do have the energy, then you can activate as many of your character's abilities as you can afford. But you can only activate each ability once per turn. And you must finish resolving one ability before you activate another. When you activate an ability, exhaust the card by turning it on its side. This indicates that the card has already been used once this turn and cannot be activated again. Cards attached to your character will ready at the start of your next turn, and then you can use them again. Once your character is flipped to its final form, you may also use their built-in activated ability. You don't exhaust your character when you use their built-in ability, but you can still only use it once per turn. Many activated abilities will share common terms that are detailed in the back of the rulebook, but let's go over a few of those now. Discard. Whenever you're asked to discard one of your cards, place that card in your discard pile. Where that card is discarded from will be described in the ability's text. For example, discard one attached card means to discard a card attached to your character. If the text simply read discard one card, then you would discard that card from your hand. Now, keep in mind, if you discard a card during your opponent's turn, you're going to start your turn with fewer than 5 cards. You don't draw back up to 5 because you only refill your hand at the end of your turn. If you ever need to discard a card from the grid, place that card in the main deck discard pile. Destroy. Whenever you're asked to destroy a card, don't put it in any discard pile. Instead, remove that card from the game. This is a great way to streamline your deck by removing your less powerful starter cards. The Blade Blaster is the one exception to this rule. As indicated here in this black bar, when you destroy the Blade Blaster card, place it face down at the bottom of the Blade Blaster stack. Control versus Own. When an effect refers to a card you control, it's referring to all the cards you've played on your turn, cards attached to your character, ongoing cards that are currently in play in front of you, and any Zord or Masters attached to your tiles. You do not control cards in your hand, deck, or discard pile. Cards you own, on the other hand, include all the cards you control, plus all the cards in your hand, deck, and discard pile. Okay, there are 2 types of attacks: targeted and non-targeted. Although in a 2-player game, like the one we're learning here, there's no difference between the two. They both boil down to the same thing: attack your opponent. No targeting or non-targeting necessary. Where the terms targeted and non-targeted come into effect is when you're playing a 3 or 4-player game. Okay, now that we have all that cleared up, let's get back to attacking. Attacks that deal damage typically read deal X damage, and if not negated, simply removes that many hit points from your opponent's hit total. Playing a card with the bold attack text on it does not activate an attack. To use a card's attack ability, the card must be attached to your character or Zord Bay. Then pay the activation cost for that attack. Only then will the attack activate. Some characters have triggered attacks, which occur when you perform a specific action. Jason Lee Scott, for example, deals 1 damage when you play or attach a hero. Not all attacks do damage. Some of them just do nasty things to your opponents, like making them discard cards. When you activate an attack, your opponent might be able to use a block card to negate the effect of that attack. When an attack is negated, it'll be discarded into the attacker's discard pile, unless the attack card says otherwise. Some attack cards might even grant you a small consolation prize, or a penalty for your foe if they're negated, kind of like a booby trap. If an attack card does not have the if negated text, then there is no side effect if the attack is blocked. If the attack reads each targeted foe, then the attack is targeted against each foe separately. But this only applies in 3 and 4 player games. In a 2-player game, it targets the only foe you have. When your opponent activates a card with the attack keyword in bold, you'll have the option of responding with a block. Blocks are cards that allow you to negate an attack. Negating attack cancels any harmful effects. For example, if an attack were to deal 6 damage to you, a single block would negate all of that damage. However, some attacks have additional text that resolves if the attack is negated. That part of the attack is not negated, and cannot be negated with another block card. For example, the Sword of Darkness attack deals 5 damage. It also reads, if negated, deal 2 damage, then discard this card. If you negate the 5 damage of the attack, you still take 2 unblockable damage. Now, where most cards have to be attached to your character before they can be activated, block cards with this hand and shield icon are unique in that they can be activated from your hand as well. Whether a block card is attached to your character or in your hand, almost all block cards have the text reading, discard this card, or something similar. This means that as part of the resolution of the block, you must discard the block card whether it was activated from your hand or attached to your character. Only one block card may be used per attack, but you don't have to block any attacks if you don't want to. It's rarely necessary to block an attack that only deals 1 or 2 damage, unless you're only at 1 or 2 hit points remaining, in which case it's probably necessary. Oh, and using a block to negate an attack, even if it's from your hand, doesn't count as playing that card. So you won't activate any effects that are triggered when a certain card type is played. For example, this location's effect triggers when I play an equipment card type. So if I played this Dragon Shield equipment card for its shards, the location's effect would activate. But if I use the same card for its block ability instead, that would not count as playing that card and would not trigger that location's effect. Most block cards also grant you a reward for blocking, like drawing a card, healing hit points, giving the other attacker a stun card, etc. What's a stun card? Glad you asked. Stun cards only exist to ruin your day. If you have any in your deck, it's probably because your opponent put them there. If you ever find yourself with 1 or more stun cards in your hand, you can return them to the stun stack by healing 2 or more hit points. This will return all the stun cards you're holding, not just 1. Heroes in the grid are adversaries of the villain player, while villains in the grid are adversaries of the hero player. Having adversary cards in the grid can take a toll on your hit points, because during your end phase, you're dealt 1 unblockable damage for each adversary in the grid. You heard me right, unblockable. So all those block cards you've been hoarding ain't gonna help. I mentioned earlier in the video that heroes can't buy villain cards and villains can't buy hero cards, but they can battle them instead. You see this number here at the bottom of the villain and hero cards? This is the shard cost required to battle that adversary. So on your turn, you can spend shards equal to this number to battle an adversary card in the grid. Doing so will remove the adversary card from the grid, which will reduce the damage you take during your end phase, and denies that card to your opponent. Any adversaries removed from the grid in this way are placed in the main deck discard pile. And remember, the grid does not refill until your opponent's next turn. In addition to removing the adversary from the grid, you get to resolve the text next to the battle icon. This will either be a reward or a penalty for your foe. This penalty is not an attack and cannot be blocked. I want to clarify that battling and attacking are completely different. Attacking is something you do against your opponent to reduce their hit points, and battling is something you do against adversary cards in the grid. And since a battle is not an attack, you can't block to protect a card. The villain player has a Lair tile. Whenever they gain a master card from the master stack, it instantly attaches to the Lair. When you attach a master to the Lair, it triggers an attack against the hero. This attack is written here to help you remember. The Lair attack deals 1 damage to the hero for each master the villain player controls. So in this example, by attaching the villain I just bought to the Lair, I would deal 1, 2, 3 damage to the hero player. In addition, the villain player gets access to all of the abilities of all the masters in the Lair. Many of these abilities are ongoing effects that trigger at the start of the villain's turn. Once attached, master cards cannot be voluntarily removed, either from the Lair or your character card. The villains have their Lair, so the heroes get a Zord Bay. The Zord Bay tile and its potential to build a Megazord is the ultimate weapon in the Ranger's arsenal. The Zord Bay has 6 slots. each of which can hold one Zord. While a Zord is attached and in the ready position, you may activate its ability during your turn. The black Mastodon Zord is the exception to this rule, because you can activate its block ability during your opponent's turn in response to an attack. When you activate a Zord, you exhaust it just like any other activated ability. But what's different, and this is very important, Zords do not ready at the start of a hero's turn. Instead, the activated ability printed on the Zord Bay tile must be used to ready the attached Zords. Just like any other activated ability, you may only use this ready ability once during each of your turns. To activate the Zord Bay ability, your character must be flipped to its ranger side. This number here indicates how many Zords the hero player may activate during each of their turns. Note that the Mastodon's block ability can always be used on the opponent's turn. And just like any master card, you can't voluntarily discard Zords from your Zord Bay. Building the Megazord and the Mega Dragon Zord is a goal that the hero player should definitely strive for. Once you have 5 Zords attached to your Zord Bay, attach the Megazord card here. This card replaces the ability of the Zord Bay. One of the biggest advantages of building your Mega is increasing the number of Zords you can activate on your turn. This number here indicates how many Zords you can activate each turn. So by building the Megazord, the hero player can now activate 3 Zords per turn instead of 1. And if a 6th Zord is attached, you instantly form Mega Dragon Zord, which allows you to activate 5 Zords per turn. The Mega Dragon Zord also gives you access to a new attack ability that deals damage equal to the number of attached Zords, which is not good for the bad guys. Activating the Megazord, or the Mega Dragon Zord's ability, does not count toward your Zord activation limit for that turn. Also, attaching or flipping a Megazord card does not reset your Zord activation limit. For example, if I activate my Red Zord, then attach a 5th Zord to build my Megazord and increase my activation number to 3, I only get 2 additional activations for this turn, because I already spent 1 activation when I used the Red Zord. Anytime you fail to meet the attachment requirements of a Mega, you immediately revert to the previous one. So, if Mega Dragon Zord loses a Zord, it reverts back to Megazord. If Megazord loses a Zord, it reverts back to the Zord Bay. Whenever you detach your Megazord card, just set it aside. It never goes into a discard pile. If a Zord gets detached from your Zord Bay for any reason, it does go into your discard pile. If you later draw that Zord back into your hand, you can just reattach it to your Zord Bay. And that's something you're definitely going to want to do because playing a Zord does absolutely nothing. Using your Mega activation to ready all Zords and possibly attack may only be performed once during your turn, even if you upgrade or downgrade your Mega during that turn. When you're done attaching, buying, and activating cards, it's time to move on to the end phase. Alright, first things first. All those unspent shards you generated this turn are lost. Not the cards that generated them, just the shards themselves. Because unlike energy, shards aren't stored from turn to turn. So if you haven't spent them, they're gone. Next, resolve any at the end of turn effects. The Blade Blaster is the most common example of this. It says that at the end of your turn, you may destroy this card to deal 1 damage to your opponent, or remove a card from the grid. This is a good way to remove adversaries before they get a chance to deal any damage. Which brings us to checking the grid for adversaries. Take 1 damage for each adversary in the grid. For example, if you're a hero player and there are 2 villains in the grid, take 2 damage. This is not an attack and therefore is not blockable. Next, you can discard any number of cards attached to your character, whether they're ready or exhausted. During your main phase, you are only allowed to discard cards in their ready position. So now's your chance to discard cards you activated during your turn. There are 2 main reasons that you might want to do this. Either to return a card to your deck, so when you draw it again, you can use it for its shards and energy instead of attaching it. Or maybe you have a card attached that no longer aligns with your plans and you want to make room for something better. Next, discard all the cards in your hand and all the cards you played this turn. except for any cards you attach to your character, Lair, or Zord Bay. Those stay attached. In addition, any cards with the ongoing text, such as locations, also stay in play. Lastly, draw cards from the top of your deck until you have 5 cards in hand. If your deck runs out of cards before you have refilled your hand to 5, draw as many as you can, then shuffle your discard pile and place it face down. This is now your new draw deck. Continue drawing from that new deck until you have 5 cards in hand. Once that's done, play passes to the opposing player. The game can end in either one of 2 ways. Either one player has reduced the other player's health to 0, or you can't add any more cards from the main deck because the deck is empty. If running out of cards is what triggered the end of the game, then finish your turn and the player with the most hit points at the end of that turn wins. If there's a tie, then the player with the most energy wins. I hope this video helped, and I hope you enjoy playing the Power Rangers deck building game. See you next week. Thanks for joining us. If you like this video and you want to see more, subscribe to our channel. It's the best way to keep up to date with everything we do here at Board Game Coffee. But if you want to see more right now, we got plenty of videos to choose from. And if that's not enough, follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. I'm Mark Maya, and this is Board Game Coffee. And remember, have fun, keep gaming, be social. See you next week.